Good evening. So we were talking before we started the formal program, and we're confident that both Louis Sullivan and Frank Lloyd Wright were in this room, probably several times. And so I'm confident that their ghosts are here. And so I just want to recommend everyone pay attention to that empty seat next to you, because Louis or Frank is with us somewhere in this room. It's also my great pleasure today to honor Frank Lloyd Wright. I would argue the two great cultural gifts to the world from Chicago was our architecture, our landscape design, our public art, and then our music. Today I had the honor of dedicating the Muddy Waters mural on State Street as we honored this great iconic figure, and then to be here this evening to honor Frank Lloyd Wright. How cool is that? So I will be reading this fancy booklet. This is the proclamation from our mayor honoring Frank on his 150th birthday. And Frank, wherever you are, I'm going to give this to you at the end of the reading of the proclamation. Whereas renowned architect, interior designer, educator, author, and Chicagoan Frank Lloyd Wright was born on June 8, 1867, and whereas a clever and astute child, Wright matured into a determined, ambitious young man who in 1887, at the age of 19, made his way to Chicago intent on becoming an architect. And whereas soon thereafter, he joined the firm of Adler and Sullivan, serving as an official apprentice where he was challenged but thrived, eventually realizing his own design aesthetic. And whereas, after about 5 years, Wright left the firm in 1893 and established an independent architectural practice with offices in the village of Oak Park, as well as the heart of downtown Chicago, where he forged the first 20 years of his impressive career. And whereas it was during these years that Wright, a passionate proponent of the Prairie School style of architecture, produced some of his most prolific work around the city of Chicago, throughout the state of Illinois, and across the Midwest, including the Winslow House in River Forest, the Roby House in Chicago, the Dana Thomas House in Springfield, and Unity Temple in Oak Park, and many, many more. And whereas Frank Lloyd Wright went on to design iconic and innovative structures such as the Guggenheim Museum, the Beth Shalom Synagogue, and other celebrated buildings the world over for their depth and craftsmanship. And whereas a man of varied talents and interests committed to his craft, Wright held over 40 commissions on the scale of community planning and urban design, pushed the envelope in integrating new materials to enhance structural interaction with the environment, and with an avid Japanese art dealer who often helped furnish the very homes he designed. And whereas Frank Lloyd Wright's immeasurable contributions to culture and society go far beyond the architectural canon, spilling into art and academia, as well as science and industry. And whereas Thursday, June 8th, 2017, will mark the 150th anniversary of the birth of Frank Lloyd Wright, and the Frank Lloyd Wright Trust celebrate this auspicious occasion with a lecture and dinner, in addition to a variety of fun, active, and educational programming for residents and visitors all year long. Now, therefore, I, Rahm Emanuel, you can see the resemblance, right? I'm just a bit taller, otherwise we're the same. Mayor of the City of Chicago, do hereby proclaim June 8th, 2017 to be the Frank Lloyd Wright Day in Chicago, in recognition of the inspiring life and inimitable legacy of an architectural giant and American icon. Frank, please come up wherever you are and receive your proclamation. Thank you very much.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Janice Katz. I'm Associate Curator of Japanese Art here at the Art Institute, and I am absolutely thrilled for the program that we have for you tonight. I would also like to thank the Frank Lloyd Wright Trust, and in particular, Celeste Adams, for organizing many of the citywide events that we're enjoying to celebrate the 150th birthday of Frank Lloyd Wright, and allowing the Art Institute to be a part of that. In addition to tonight's lecture, the museum's part of the celebration includes an exhibition that I curated that's up now in our Japanese art galleries entitled Frank Lloyd Wright and the Formation of the Japanese Print Collection at the Art Institute, in which all of the Japanese prints on view were sold by Frank Lloyd Wright to Clarence Buckingham, who gave them, along with the rest of his collection, to the Art Institute in 1925. So please have a look at the show. It's up until July 23rd, and tonight the museum is open until 8 o'clock. Thank you.
Good evening. I'm Celeste Adams. I'm the president and CEO of the Frank Lloyd Wright Trust here in Chicago. Thank you, Mark Kelly, for an official and fitting opening to this evening's program. We are grateful to the Art Institute for their partnership in this event, to Fawn Ring and her incredible staff for their flawless coordination, and to the always gracious Janice Katz for working with us on this celebration and creating a beautiful and enlightening exhibition that I hope you will take time to visit. I add my own thanks to our lecture sponsor, Terra Foundation for American Art, and our event sponsor, Bully & Andrews. Due to our schedule this evening and the size of the audience, there will not be questions following the lecture. If we are fortunate, our good works survive beyond our lifetime. And in the case of some exceptional people, what remains is a unique contribution to our culture. Today, we celebrate the 150th birthday of Frank Lloyd Wright. Getting along with Wright as a personality is no longer an issue. Understanding Wright's vision, its significance, its complexity, its sources, and its impact is the task before us. This evening's speaker is uniquely qualified to take this on, in the particular aspect of Wright's special relationship with Japan and its culture. Kevin Nute is professor of architecture at University of Oregon and a lifelong admirer of Chicago. He trained at universities of Nottingham and Cambridge in the United Kingdom and worked in architectural practice in Hong Kong and Singapore, was a Fulbright Scholar at the University of California, Berkeley, and a Japan Foundation Research Fellow at University of Tokyo. He is author of Place, Time, and Being in Japanese Architecture, John Yan and the Landscape Arts of China and Japan, Vital, Using the Weather to Bring Buildings and Sustainability to Life, and Frank Lloyd Wright and Japan, published in 1993, the finest work yet written on this subject. It won the International Architectural Monograph Award from the American Institute of Architects and remains today the primary source for Wright's enduring association with Japan. His topic this evening is The Art of Life, Frank Lloyd Wright and the Organic Nature of Japanese Art. I am so very pleased to introduce you to Kevin Nute.
Thank you. I have two things in common with Frank Lloyd Wright: my height, and I'm also difficult to get on with. And that's where the resemblance ends. There's a lot to get in, but half of my life has been devoted to Frank Lloyd Wright. I figured out the other day, 30 years ago, more than 30 years ago, this work started for me, and I'm still interested enough to learn things about Wright's relationship to Japan. So I'm honored to be here, and thank you for coming. So you are by now very aware, I hope you've seen the exhibition that talks about Wright's exhibitions of Japanese prints here at the Art Institute. So this is really kind of the center of everything, which is why I'm so pleased to be here. Wright had this passion, this lifelong, or at least most of his lifelong, from his late teens, and there have been multiple roles that Japanese art played in his life as a commercial product, as a sort of an artistic obsession. But what I wanted to talk about this evening is, well, what was the connection between this two-dimensional foreign art form and American art and design? Wright was not a hobbyist. He didn't do things without a real reason. And if he didn't play into his work and his career, I don't think he wouldn't have played golf, for example. Well, one of the better-known connections with Japan happened in 1893. The Phoenix Hall, the Japanese pavilion, right in the middle of the wooded isle, stayed for 50 years as an exemplar of Japanese design, and there was art in it, and I'll talk about that in a moment. Some of that art is right here in the Art Institute, so this is really ground zero. The ranma, this perforated screen, and the painted, gilded fusuma are both found their way back to the Art Institute, which is amazing. So there are the ranma screens that you can see in the Art Institute right outside. And these are more recently discovered fusuma from the central hall of the Hoden, which I had a very interesting conversation with Janice Katz, who's investigating this. More to be announced about that, I'm sure. So here's what Wright had to say. The Momoyama. So Momoyama period, this is when the gilded screen style began. Wright was a great fan and described it as organic, and we'll talk more about that. So here's what he did. This is what Janice referred to, some examples. He actually incorporated Momoyama screens into, this is his own home, but he did it to his clients' places as well. Very interesting client-architect relationship. These had to be repossessed by the local sheriff eventually. So back to the Hoden. One of the really interesting things about the Hoden is who wrote the catalog. He was not here, but Okakura Kakuzo is far better known as the author of the Book of Tea, that Wright quoted very often on the subject of Lao Tzu and the reality of architecture and of vessels, all kinds of vessels being the space contained. And it was really that connection that started me on this sort of path. Okakura was one of the Boston Four, the Boston Japanologists then. Terrible term, but I don't know of a better one. So here's Okakura, the person I'd like to talk to. They're all four fascinating individuals, but it's this chap to his right who I will mostly concentrate on. Ernest Fenollosa began as his teacher of philosophy and ended up as his student of Japanese art, and that's the way it worked. So here's what Wright had to say in 1917, okay? So we know that Wright was very well aware of Ernest Fenollosa, the Western world's leading expert on Japanese art at the time. Nobody better equipped. Because he'd actually been there. Most of them had not. The big connection is that Wright's first employer before Adler and Sullivan was Joseph Silsby, very well-respected Shingo-style architect, but his most important role for Frank Lloyd Wright, at least in his relationship to Japan, was he was a cousin of Ernest Fenollosa. And cousin Fenollosa used to come visit in Edgewater on a regular basis. We don't know if they ever met directly, but we can tell from Wright's admiration that he knew enough about Fenollosa to take an interest in his interpretations of Japanese art, and in particular, his interpretation of Japanese art as an organic art form, an exemplar for all other art forms. So Wright's own book on Japanese prints, published in 1912, was largely based on Ernest Fenollosa's aesthetics theory of the organic whole. And I'll try to explain what I think that is. One of the characteristics of the Japanese print that Wright really admired was its expression of everyday life. This is a fictional image of how Japanese prints are made. The Japanese print makers look nothing like this, unfortunately. But it was a craft. There were multiple phases. It was made handmade paper, cherry block prints. He loved the fact that it was a human involved craft. And expressed everyday life, everything from the cat looking out the window to the public baths and street lives. And this is what he had to say about it. Right? So that was one characteristic of the print that he loved, that it was ordinary, it was popular. He called it democratic. In Japan, in fact, at the time, it was looked upon as lowbrow popular art. Even Fenollosa looked down upon it initially, and then discovered how popular it was and changed his mind. But if we look at some of these prints up close, you can see the wood grain still within, right? This is one of the characteristics that Wright loved, that it's what you see is what you get, right? There's no covering, its production, its mode of production is expressed in the final form. And if you look at Japanese architecture, as Wright obviously did, then that same characteristic, that the means of production is there in the final product. And he loved that. So this is what he had to say about the Japanese house, that it expressed a certain lifestyle, and it did it in a completely straightforward, honest way. So that's one characteristic that he loved. The other one, another one, is its rootedness in place. So the prints that Wright most loved were by Hiroshige and to some degree Hokusai. And they came out in these series, and they were very often place-based. Some were themed in other ways. But so here's Wright's famous, or Hiroshige's famous 100 Views of Edo, and you can see they're all located. They're all specific, well-known places. And this was Wright's favorite series by his favorite print artist, because they are landscape prints printed in a portrait format, which has all sorts of interesting characteristics or effects on the depth of space. So here he is talking about Japanese buildings, but the prints are equally rooted in place. A couple of examples then. The content of the prints was very often to do with built structures, and Wright's buildings are famously connected, as in the Prairie House, to where they belonged. Falling water, likewise. It's absolutely part of the waterfall, and the waterfall is part of it. Okay, so now we get on to the meat of this, the mutually interdependent parts. That's really at the crux, I think, of what Wright understood by the term organic, that it was composed of standard parts, like an organism, and like the organs in an organism, each of those parts was completely interdependent. If you lost one, it would be very problematic. The organic whole would possibly cease to exist. This was confirmed for him by one of Hokusai's printed books, and here's Wright's description of that, where he described, now to us today it's absolutely straightforward, but in 1812 and 1890s it was less straightforward, less obvious that you could create, quotes, organic forms, living forms from geometrical, mechanical shapes. And it's often misunderstood that Wright's buildings are necessarily curvilinear. They're not. Obviously, most of them are not. But it's the relationship of those parts, not the particular geometry that Wright meant by organic. So interdependence of parts is a key part. And here's Wright confirming that, essentially. And its source or confirmation in Far Eastern structures. So for want of a better term, then, that interdependence of the balance of individual expression, but also being connected back to a larger whole. For Wright, that really expressed an ideal of democracy as well. We are as free as possible as individuals, right up to the point where we start to impinge on the next person's freedom. And then we have to be part of a whole, no loose cannons. even though Wright probably was as loose as they get. But still, he recognized that he was part of a society, and he really was. So that word, that organic, then really covered a huge range of meanings, from art through to design to society itself. Some examples of the expression of that from Wright's own work, and you can see this is a pretty direct two-dimensional expression of the individual part, but connected back to the organic whole, right? Arthur Dow was a colleague and friend of Ernest Fenollosa. He assisted him in the Japanese department at the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. But his claim to fame was that he turned Fenollosa's theory of art into an art textbook in 1899, Composition. And here are some examples of quotes: organic line ideas. And the very term, organic line idea would appear to be a contradiction in terms, but clearly they weren't talking about something that looked like an amoeba or something superficially organic, but a relationship of parts. So these intersecting, interlocking shapes were one example of many. If you analyze those according to contemporary morphological characteristics of biological form, they have 4 of the basic components, characteristics of living forms. So Fenollosa and Dow certainly didn't know this, and yet they were right, that these characteristics are found in living organisms. They weren't biologists, but they got it right. So some examples of the expression of this. So this decoration was often misunderstood. The Imperial Hotel was roundly criticized, often by people who weren't Japanese, because it didn't have anything to do with Japan. Well, absolutely, it had nothing to do with any particular place. It was independent. It didn't have content. It was pure form, like a piece of classical music. You wouldn't stop at the end and go, that was very nice, but what did it mean? Yeah? So it doesn't mean anything. It's beautiful, beautiful form. Talking of beautiful form, I don't know if you... can I trust you not to take this home with you? This is a piece of the Imperial Hotel. Now, I'm not that old, and I didn't steal it. It's made from the same mold, so if you'd like to hand that around, it's heavy, really heavy. I give somebody with weak wrists. I pick somebody with weak wrists. Perfect, right. It came from the same mold. It's not actually from the Imperial Hotel. That would be illegal, and I'd get in trouble. But I would like it back, please. So some of the textile block patterns that Wright created for his concrete block houses in Southern California can actually be made by combining Dow organic line ideas. Now, we don't know, but interesting. Right? But that's how Wright could keep a straight face and say, this is organic decoration. And a lot of people thought, what? What does that mean? This is Mayan, it's geometrical. What has that got to do with an organism? Again, it's to do with the relationship of parts, not the individual geometry. So in his work, his own work, Wright appears to have taken that into the 3rd dimension. So you have this characteristic interlocking of spaces. So it only really took to extrude those 2-dimensional interlocking patterns into 3 dimensions, you end up with interlocking spaces. And if you remove the space, the solid between, you get Wright's characteristic or interpenetrating space, where you can stand in this area and feel like you're actually occupying 2 rooms, where in any normal building that would be a corner. There's no way to be in both places at the same time. So that, I think, is what Wright felt or meant as organic space. Interdependence with the environment. Well, conventional, possibly Western picture frame. The print artists, and particularly Hiroshige, used foreground elements in the image itself as a replacement for the frame. And Wright commented on this, that you really feel like you're part of the space. If you just brush aside that foliage, you'd actually be right there in the scene itself. And Wright did similar things by encroaching into using foliage and other foreground images This stuff has become a cliche in architectural rendering, but it comes from Japan and it comes from Hiroshige. Maybe even before him, possibly China. So if we look at some examples of that, here's a Hiroshige print, and you see in this case it's the lantern and the gate posts. But Wright, this is a Frank Lloyd Wright photograph from his 1905 visit. You can see he's trying to ape that in his photography. Even photography was not a hobby. Nothing was a hobby. It all was grist to the mill. Right? Whoops. So a couple of examples then. I think this, in fact, I know that this print is on display in the current exhibit. And you can see this weeping willow tree. He's replaced it, I think, with wisteria. I'm not a botanist, but the point I want to make is that the frame is almost gone, that you're just one side of the foliage. You're really there with the Winslow house, just as Hiroshige did with his prints. Again, with Unity Temple, the frame is completely disappeared, so the space of the picture comes out and below our feet. We're right in there. So the two-dimensional frame was broken. Here's a famous rendering by Marion Mahoney Griffin of the De Rhodes house. If you've got really good eyesight, you might be able to read the inscription bottom right. It's kind of pixelated, but it says, drawn by Mahoney after Frank Lloyd Wright and Hiroshige, which was pretty cheeky to do that on someone else's drawing. But there's the smoking gun that he did acknowledge, that this characteristic of using foreground foliage and elements in the scene as a replacement for the conventional frame. Because he felt that the conventional frame, basically conventional artists would go to great lengths to do something super realistic to convince you that a two-dimensional plane was actually three-dimensional space, and then would put a large frame around it to say, no, it's not. So this went straight into 3 dimensions. So a conventional window frame, for example, then would be like this. Wright's famous art glass windows, and there are plenty at the Art Institute, the frame starts to encroach across the scene, so it blurs the line between interior and exterior space. So here's the Susan Dana Lawrence house, and you can see it gets hard in this case to tell what is real and what is abstract foliage. And that's really the frame being taken across so that it's right there with the renderings and the Hiroshige prints. If you just brush aside that foliage, you're outside. So this erosion of the conventional solid frame then is probably, in my view anyway, the biggest lesson that Wright derived from the prints. This is Hokusai, Wright's other favored print artist, and he's breaking the frame. So Fuji's big, but to emphasize just how big, it's so big you can't contain it within the picture frame, right? It bursts out of the top. And Wright does, Hiroshige did the same thing, of course. They were, he was a great admirer of Hokusai and tried to emulate him later. And of course, Frank Lloyd Wright can't be outdone, so this is what he does with, but this is the best compliment that any artist can play to another one, right? It really is. Here's Wright in the famous Vathmus drawings of 1911, where there are elements that are coming, sort of bursting out of the frame here, and there are things that are coming into the frame, and he's trying to send the same message, that the picture frame is this artificial separation between the represented space and real space, and he wants to break that down. And if we look at Wright's buildings, then if this is the conventional building plan, then Wright's buildings are an example of an exploded frame where it's fragmented and elements that are not normally within the architecture are taken within, and elements that are not normally outside are taken outside. So he's deliberately trying to blur that line between natural and architectural space. So here's the Winslow house. This is the Winslow stable, far less well known than the Winslow house. But This was probably about 35 years before Le Corbusier did this in an exhibition building. The pavilion de l'Esprit Nouveau, I believe it was. And that was regarded as very avant-garde. And here's Wright. He could have easily taken this tree out, but he's trying to send a message that that the tree previously occupied this space, and a more important message about our relationship to the natural environment, that there needs to be a cohabitation. We shouldn't occupy space at the expense of, we should do so in cooperation with nature. A message that apparently still needs sending. But Wright was way ahead of that he would have been a sustainable green architect if those terms had ever existed in his time. I'm absolutely certain of it. So here's an example from Falling Water, where it would have been absolutely easy or possibly more sensible to have taken the tree down or moved these beams. But he chooses very deliberately to locate the beam there and then take this detour to say that the tree is more important than the beam. The trees often died, unfortunately, because they're too close to the foundations of the building. But the message is far more important, right? It's tough if you're the tree, but the message the big message is a lot more important, of cooperation between the made and the natural. There isn't this hard line, or shouldn't be this hard line between them. So pictorial art and pictorial space and real space can be one. Interior space and external space can be one. Built space and natural space can be one. So Falling Water is probably the last word on that in Wright's career, at least, where elements come out into nature. And it's really hard to know where is the line between architecture and or the made object, the designed object, and nature. And so the frameless glazing, there is glazing here, but he's deliberately recessed it, and he's using materials inside that you would probably more associate with outside to deliberately blur that line between the made and the natural. So I don't actually know if he was illustrating the point that I'm trying to make, but it does illustrate the point, I think, rather well, that I think this sums up what for me at least, was Wright's notion of the organic, then, of this completely interconnected world where nothing is separate. Even if it appears to be, everything influences everything else, and everything is connected and interdependent. You can't do something that doesn't have an effect on something else or someone else. So, as is appropriate on the great man's birthday, Frank gets to have the last word. I think I did that in record time, so thank you for listening.